Hey, dear friends, we are back for another episode of the Artisans of the Horizon, and we have our guest today is a repeat guest, our dear friend, Dr. Theodore Richards with Wisdom Projects Incorporated in Chicago. Theodore, why don't you tell us a bit about yourself and, what are you bringing to the table today?
Thank you, Jerry. My background is as a philosopher and a writer, and an educator. And in 2009, I started an organization called the Chicago Wisdom Project, which has evolved and grown into what is now Wisdom Projects Incorporated. We do work in Chicago and in Baltimore with the Baltimore Wisdom Project. I've been working on, in addition to the work we do, we are a holistic education organization. We believe in liberatory education. We work with youth. We believe that the youth in places like East Baltimore and the South Side of Chicago deserve to have the same nurturing, holistic education as anyone. And so we believe in educating for the whole human, and which means not just the human beings, different elements, but also the whole human in terms of its relationships to the world beyond. We do a lot of work to sort of engage the world about education and about a philosophy of education that's all inclusive and and that is more holistic and integrated.
And I know that the last time you were here, we talked about your book on the apocalypse, which if I had thought about it in advance, I would have had it here to show people. But they can go see that conversation in the link below. And this time we're coming back around to discuss Reimagining Education, your new book on exploring how to expand our understanding of education and the classroom and how that applies to our current time. So why don't you share with us about that?
Yeah, so the idea is the idea is that when I refer to a classroom, I'm not thinking of just a physical space or a room with four walls. I'm thinking about a learning space that could be a forest, that could be, and I started this whole process during the pandemic, right? And my two younger children, I have three daughters, my two younger children were being homeschooled. So each day we had to kind of wake up and decide what we were going to teach. I mean, we had a plan and a curriculum and so forth, but like our classroom was at times our backyard, at times our living room, at times our kitchen, at times we actually left Chicago and spent 3 months in Florida. So sometimes it was the beach. So the idea is that a classroom itself is not just a room with four walls. A classroom is a metaphor for the world that we hope to create beyond. And so when we ask the question, what are we going to teach each day? What we're really asking is what's actually important? What are our values? What's meaningful to us? So you could look at it as a classroom as a microcosm. That is to say that like it reflects the values of the cosmos, the world that we're creating beyond. And it's not, so it happens not just with like the curriculum, meaning not just with the content we teach. That's important, right? But it's all of the ways in which we relate and interact in that learning space, the symbols, the stories, everything that we have in that learning space. That's kind of the most significant thing that we're teaching, not just the what, but the how and the why.
It's kind of like an incubation space where you can practice ideas and creating ideas and bringing all of yourself into the midst. I think when we moved into this, what some people call the Aquarian age, this new level of consciousness of thinking about ourselves, of others, and the way we live in this realm. One of the things that I think is really interesting is that people are becoming more aware that it is actually possible to live an integrated life. And I think for me, as a community organizer, as a priest, as someone who shows up with the intent of standing in the midst of everything and saying, there's always a better way. And that way is the sacred way, and that way is to live holistically, to use your word. I think that the greatest rebuttal to our modern consciousness into a postmodern consciousness is this idea that we can bring all of ourselves into a space. And if we learn to deal with all of that complexity and all of that, then we learn to have a much more robust way of thinking about ourselves and of life. Um, and we have more, we've discovered more tools for dealing with the things that are happening in our world.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think that what happens in the learning space is that what we're really doing there is we're telling a story about, and you use the term like about what, and one way to look at it is we it's an investigation into what's actually sacred. Like when I say like what's important in the world, I think that's a question, you know, people get caught up in kind of like theological discourse. You as a priest
Hmm.
will be familiar with those conversations. I think a better question than to ask theological questions about the nature of God is maybe a more significant question is to ask what do we hold sacred? I think to me that tells us a lot more about a person's spiritual life and about their worldview than those other questions. You know, not that they're not important and interesting, but I think that one of the things we're doing in a classroom, in any learning space, and we're doing it whether we're conscious of it or not, is we are conveying to the people in that space, what do we hold sacred? And we do it not by saying, well, you know, giving someone a list of things that are sacred, right? You know, in terms of that kind of interaction, we do it in the ways that we interact with people in that space. We do it in the kind of the subtle symbolism of the space. For example, if we sit in a circle in which each person can see one another and be seen, in which each person can hear one another and be heard, then we're teaching each person that their words, their thoughts, their feelings are held sacred. So creating a culture of care in that space tells
Hmm.
them that those kinds of interactions, the kind of meaningful, caring, nurturing interactions, that each other, we are sacred in that space, right? So that's just like an example of a way we can convey values. If we have to ask permission to use the bathroom, we're teaching people that someone else has control over our bodies. If we sit in rows and listen to someone in front, we're learning a lesson about agency and power. We're learning that someone possesses the power and the information and knowledge, and that the learning happens when they give it to us, rather than the space being a fundamentally relational space in which knowledge and information and power are shared, and something that happens, not just that the learning itself happens not just when someone gives it to you, but in the relationship, in the interactions. And I think that fundamental shift in terms of shifting from individualism to relationship is, I think that's the shift that's one of the core shifts in this paradigm that you're referring to, this paradigm change that you're referring to, from individualism to relationality.
Yeah, and it's really a shift, kind of like a hopping back to, you know, what our
Indeed.
friend
Yeah.
Matt Fox would call pre-modern consciousness. You know, this is really indigenous thinking. It's, you know, we indigenous people have always seen ourselves as collectivists. You know, we're not in just one thing. We're the byproduct of many different people, and we carry that with us in every space. And yeah, so it's a different way of thinking for sure. But you know, education also means to lead out of ignorance, right? And so part of learning is to learn that we don't know something, or that maybe we have learned something incorrectly. And often tell people, you know, the greatest thing about education is when you become empowered, you realize that you always have the ability and the grace to start over.
Yeah. Well, a couple things there. So like I definitely draw from indigenous epistemologies and indigenous practices. So like, for example, one thing that's really in vogue now, and it's a wonderful thing that it's in vogue, is what's called restorative justice, or I like to refer to it as restorative practices, and because it can be employed not just in a state of conflict, but in all different kind of scenarios. And essentially, without getting into details, essentially it's a practice that's largely, if not completely, borrowed from indigenous ways of living. And it is, if just to synthesize it really quickly, it emphasizes that when let's say for a conflict, it emphasizes that the issue, the core thing that we have to focus on is not punishment or retribution. Rather, we have to focus on the restoration of the relationship. And that doesn't mean people don't take responsibility or do wrong things. It doesn't mean that those things aren't wrong, but it means that the key thing we must do is restore that relationship. It's a way of interacting with people that honors the fundamental focus on relationship. And if it's practiced in a classroom, it's a way of moving towards social justice in the world that's not just focused on punishment and retribution or on individualism. It's focused on relationship. So it's a great example of kind of a model of the world rooted in indigenous worldviews that shows how a classroom can be a model for the world or a metaphor for the world. So I think that it's really important to honor that that many of these ideas and practices have come before, you know. And also,
Yeah.
to speak to your point about the kind of humility. One of the kind of core metaphors I use in the book actually has to do with, like, when I think about what are the metaphors, if not, you know, we use the metaphors, I think that the modern, with a capital N, classroom, the conventional classroom uses. I refer to the metaphors as being a prison, a factory, and the free market. Those are kind of the basis of the kind of like civilizational foundational models we have for what it means to be in the world. And those are all highly individualistic models for the world. I think that shifting towards a more relational, more organic, more holistic model requires new metaphors. So one of the metaphors I use actually is the metaphor of that we have to think of the classroom as a space in which we cultivate humility as a core value of the classroom. And how do you do that, right? Well, I would suggest that that begins with the person who is the elder, the teacher, modeling that humility, rather than dictating it to other people without modeling it. I think the way you teach humility is by showing that we are all in process. We are all learning. No one is finished being educated. And that's kind of the key there, is that we're always learning. No one's ever fully educated.
Right. I think one of the sad, not sad, but one of the realities that we kind of live in now is because of the advances in the field of medicine, a lot of people are living longer. And so the average age in workforces is quite broader than it used to be. And so there are a lot of workplaces that are very intergenerational now. And people are discovering that there are quite unique differences between every generation, which we've always kind of known, but I think they're much more exaggerated now. And one of the things that I think has come out of that is this idea that if you have gray hair, that you are an elder, which I don't find that to be true at all. I think that there are a lot of gray-headed people who have been around for a long time who really are just dusty people. And they haven't really learned much of anything, especially the ultimate lesson that we all have to learn at some point, that we really don't know anything. That we are always an opportunity for growth. There's always an opportunity for growth, and that there is always an opportunity for us to expand in our awareness of self and others in society and life. And so I always find that a true elder is a person who has that innate ability to be humble, to say, I don't know yet, but I'm still on the journey. Let's be companions together. Whether you are a child who is just like a little person, or you are somebody who's been around for a really long time. Really, there is no distinction between the two except your longevity. But the commonality is that we're both learning. And can we learn together with each other as companions? Which ultimately is a communal thing. It's a collective thing. You know, companion means to break bread together. So Yeah, so I'm just adding on to what you said.
Yeah, I think we need different generations, right? We need youth and we need elders and we need people in between. Um, there are things that we can learn from a young person. I have a teenage daughter. My oldest daughter is a teenager. She's in high school, and there are things that today's young people know about and do that are completely new, and they're engaging the world in a way that I did not as a young person. So I have a great deal to learn from young people, and from elders as well. And I think what's important. I think there are fewer. It's interesting because I think also in education there are not enough opportunities for shared learning, intergenerational learning. I think that's a real, and in fact, like to such an extent that grades are segregated, year by year, rather than at most schools, rather than integrating, say, an older child with a younger one. There's so many things that you learn from having to take care of a younger child, for example, to teach them, to becoming a teacher, to being responsible for a younger child. And too often, I think our kids are only segregated into single grade, single age spaces, learning from older children, learning from young adults, learning from elders, all of those opportunities. We kind of stuff the elders away in nursing homes and don't pay much attention to them either. All those are missed opportunities, I think, for learning, shared learning among all of us.
Right, and it's additional data in some regards. Like you don't know every person brings a certain level of gift to a certain situation, and you don't know necessarily what the answer is if you're only getting data from one source. But if you bring in other elements, other people, other vantage points, you get more of a fuller picture. So I often say I don't think the sacred circle is ever diminished by bringing more people in and expanding it.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, for example, I teach a college level philosophy class, and my students are very diverse and from different. There are a lot of older students, and one of the things I always say in this class is that the learning happens. It's not about me teaching them philosophical ideas. They can go look at some YouTube videos for that or whatever, or certainly not jargon or anything like that, which I don't care much for. But like what really it is that we have a classroom which is a space for shared inquiry and dialogue, and in conversation, that's where the actual learning happens. It doesn't happen. There are things that I might know that they don't know, but each student has a unique lens through which they see something, right? So each time you bring a different person into the space, there's a new lens through which they see that and convey that, and we all learn together in that process. It's that space in between the individuals, not the individual giving it to another individual, where the learning actually happens.
We're having this conversation during the season of winter, and on the teaching of the medicine wheel, winter is the time of year. It's the black portion in the medicine wheel. Is the time of year associated with the elders, and because the elders in native culture are the ones who are believed to be the story keepers, who pass on the stories to the next generation. And winter is associated also with longevity and learning to make time to sit with those who are elders, so that you can learn those sacred stories and learn the sacred art of longevity, which you oftentimes don't appreciate until you get to a certain point in your life. Uh, and oftentimes that comes with gray hair, but not necessarily. And I think that's a really interesting teaching, in that we're told to slow down, to take more care for what we're doing, for who we are with, and ultimately it teaches us that it's important to be curious, because curiosity is the key that allows us to have enough courage to dive deeply into the mystery of life, into the depth of life. And I think when we teach children, but even young adults, and other folks, how to do that as a regular daily practice of existing, we become more better, I think, at dealing with the way that the world is unfolding in front of us. We've become less fearful.
Yeah, I think what was interesting is that as you were talking about the kind of seasonal shifts and like there's, you know, how we can reflect on, you know, sort of different things depending on what season it is, which is a surely a more natural way of being in the world, and a way that's more consistent with how most humans function would have functioned for kind of 99% of human existence, right? It's
Mhm.
only recently when we began to enter into this capitalist industrial age, people started selling their labor on a very rigid schedule, that we had this kind of abstraction of time and this notion that we have to do the same thing year round regardless of season. You know what I mean?
Mhm.
Um, and that's very much reflected in our schools. If you think about like how a school, these high schools, the high school that my oldest daughter goes to, for example, which is very much modeled on a factory. There's very specific finite amounts of time, and bells ring and they move from class to class to class, right? Um, that's all just sort of assumed and normalized, that because that is a reflection of and reflects back to the worldview of our civilization. And we assume that that's the way it has to be, but there are many, many other ways of thinking about what a classroom, what a learning space, what a school can be.
You know, one of the things that I kind of pick up from your book is that it's really challenging us to see kind of this interplay between the personal and the collectivistic, which is the idea that, you know, these practices really that we're discussing um, can be practiced within group settings, but they also have to be practiced within ourselves, with our own personal daily existence. You know, I recently had a conversation with Deborah Eden Toll, who's a Buddhist teacher and who wrote a book called Luminous Darkness. And one of the things that we talked about in our conversation was that the darkness teaches us to learn how to belong to ourselves. And I think that that's something that really is a shifting point in as we move from this modern to postmodern Aquarian age, is that we have to spend time with ourselves, not as an individual, but as someone who takes care of ourselves. And I think that's very different because our way our classrooms are designed, the way our workspaces are designed, the way our churches are designed, they're all designed to believe that you are deficient and therefore you need to go seek out your completion in these other spaces. In the classroom, it's this idea that you don't know anything, you're stupid. So the teacher knows everything. That's why they're up in the front and they're gracing you with the gift of having some knowledge. But they only ever give you just enough to get you to keep going in their system because you're really just a commodity to them. You know, you're just a thing that they can make money off of. It's a modern form of slavery in a lot of respects, and that goes all the way up into all levels of education and American capitalist education. But then you also have it in church as well, where you are not told that you are sacred. You are told that you are at most suspect. And this great religious figure who's up in the front, who's usually male, but sometimes isn't always, and they have all the answers and they know all of the mysteries of the universe and they are helping you um, somehow appease this god who is really just perpetually pissed off at you. um, and you know, you have it in your workplaces too, where, you know, one of the great things about the workplace today is that there is much more of a consciousness now around boundaries and people enacting those boundaries and realizing that you're more than just a commodity. And so that shifting is taking place. But anyway, that all of that happens, that shifting cannot happen if you don't learn to see yourself as something that's valuable and lovable and sacred in and of itself. So, you know, we talked about in the beginning, what is sacred? You know, if we interpret that as sacred as something that matters, then we have to begin with ourselves and say that we matter. And therefore, we need to have justice because justice is a direct violation of that inherent dignity that we all have. But we have to learn how to do that because we're not, for centuries, we have been taught not to do that.
Yeah, so essentially what you're doing in a learning space is you're conveying a story to people. You're conveying a story in every learning space, every classroom, and that can be a church, a school, a family, is conveying a story which tells you about power. It tells you about how much you matter. It tells you what you're capable of. And I think the most important thing, and I say this from just like on the ground experience working with young people, the most important thing in any learning space is creating a culture of care in which people can sit together and not just from the teacher or elder, but among each other, actually feel cared for in that space. When that happens, all the other stuff becomes possible. And partly that starts with this notion that rather than coming into a space as sort of fallen and deficient, because one of the narratives we always start with is the narrative of deficiency. There's something wrong with you that needs to be fixed, and that's very much what you're talking about. Shifting from that to an asset narrative. In other words, none of us is fully is perfect or fully formed, but each of us has a gift that we bring. And let's think about what that might be as a starting point rather than how we are deficient. And that's about conveying a story.
Yeah, I sometimes use an analogy of saying that, the universe has a song that's continually to play throughout the cosmos, and our job is to learn how to dance with each other to that song. And some people are better dancers than others. Some people dance a certain type of way, others dance a different type of way. And that intermingling, that sharing of rhythm is a learning process and a way of living that's unique and different. Something that I wanted to kind of push us towards in this conversation is when I was an educator, I used to teach music and religious ed. I had some training in dealing with students who had learning differences, and I oftentimes thought it was a lot more fun than teaching other kids, mainly because the stories that the kids would tell me would sometimes be so off the radar that I thought, what world are you living in? It sounds like such fun. Like, how can I tap into that world? Like, give me a little bit of info on that. I remember once, this is completely not related, but a couple of years ago, I was in San Francisco and I was wandering around the Tenderloin, kind of exploring. It was my first time in the Tenderloin. And for those who don't know, the Tenderloin is considered like a really rough part of San Francisco. And which is, I think, just like a very casual form of racism. Everybody says that about neighborhoods that have just like Black and brown people in it, and poor folks. But I thought it was
usually in San Francisco. For those who don't know, it's I used to live in the Bay Area. It's proximity to like some of the extreme wealth of San Francisco is unusual for
right.
Yeah, I think that's part of the kind of dynamic at play there.
Right, exactly. And I was wandering around and I was exploring and just being fun. And this woman came up to me who was clearly either she was on something or she had some type of mental difference. Either way, she was not on this planet. And she was hilarious. And she stopped me and was like, I love your hair. It looks so good. And we had this conversation for like 5 minutes and it was funny. I was like, well, whatever world you are on, if you figured out how to get there, like, please let us know because it sounds like it's a lot of fun. And she's like, I'll bring you a plane ticket next time I see you. Like, great. But anyway, that kind of playfulness, I think, is really something that's very unique to education because it's something that's very subversive in our education spaces. because playfulness is the energy of the mystics. It allows us to see beyond what's right in front of us. And it requires us not to take ourselves too seriously. And can we say, that's interesting. I don't know about that. Let's dive into that some more. What do you know? Let's compare notes. And I think children tend to be a lot more open to that playfulness, and that way of thinking about the world and operating in the world. And that was certainly a lesson that I learned as a teacher, was that sometimes the best teaching that you can do is just to get your students to be playful with themselves and with this material that we're kind of going over.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, like I think as educators, we have to get over the idea that people can only be intelligent in one particular way. I think thinking of multiple intelligences and how different people learn is just good practice as an educator, period, right? I have 3 children and they all learn very differently, and some of them need particular help in certain ways and are really gifted in other ways. So I see it with my own children and certainly with other young people as well. I would say also, that notion of playfulness is so important. It's actually another one of the metaphors that I use for how to create a learning space is what I refer to as wildness and play. A lot of what our school systems and our classrooms do is because we're so afraid of what we perceive as the inherent wildness of children that we attempt to control them. It's out of fear, and it's out of a fear that runs deep for human beings. That's why we've paved over wild spaces. That's why we've killed off all the big predators. We're afraid of the wild. But playfulness. But we know now that ecologically and for the biosphere, we actually need those wild spaces. We need the forests. It's more than just planting trees. A forest is a whole ecosystem that is self-created. And we need that wildness and self-creativity that happens there. Learning most efficiently happens among small children. A lot of learning, like I'm talking about preschool, is just play-based. And we do a better job of doing that with small children than we do with older people. You and I are playing here. This is play. That's all this is. We're throwing ideas around. We're having a conversation. We're doing it in a little more grown-up way than my 7-year-old and 9-year-old do it, but it's play. It's how we learn. That's how human beings learn. It's how every work of creativity has happened in human history. It's through play. So I think that's just such a fundamental, basic element of learning and of good educational practice is play. And I will also say this, that has to be said about it. There is an element of classism and racism when it comes to how much playfulness and how much need to control happens in a classroom.
Right.
So that playfulness is much more, people are more comfortable with the playfulness in some spaces than in others.
Absolutely. And I think that gets to the point to the understanding that in our classroom settings, there is this. I think it's funny that in our current dialogue, political dialogue, when we talk about education, there's a lot of this false narrative being promulgated to cultivate fear and control, that there's a political agenda in our classrooms, and it's people
Right.
are saying that it's like this leftist agenda or whatever. And I think it's quite funny in that I think they're right that there is a political agenda at play in the American education system. I don't think it's liberalism. I think it's this idea that we need to control Black and brown bodies and poor kids, and that we need to teach people how to be good commodities so that we can sell you to the highest bidder. And don't worry about being fully alive, as some would say, or anything like that. You're just this one little thing, and we're going to sell you off, and then we're going to sell more of the kids who are more liking to our liking than others, and those of you who we can commodify will demonize you and then put you in jail and possibly execute you. And I think that that's really the agenda that's at play. And that becomes more transparent when we begin to confront some of these ideas with your methods and models and shifting of our understanding that no, we're humans, and we have unique gifts that we have to bring to the table, and we need to have spaces where we can do that. Um, so there's a
Yeah.
there, yeah. Go
Yeah,
ahead.
and I totally agree with that. I think that for one, if there is a political agenda, it is a right-wing conservative political agenda that's happening. Um, I think that, having kids stand for the Pledge of Allegiance, having ROTC in the schools, all of those kinds of things, and these like just like outright lies that are taught in some of these conservative textbooks, like all of those things are obvious right-wing political agendas in schools. I will say this. The answer is to, like, say the Pledge of Allegiance is not having the kids stand and say some different, more liberal slogan. Because I do see that in some like so-called progressive schools that want to push progressive values, the values that I agree with. The way you teach progressive values, though, I'm suggesting is, yes, you have those things in the curriculum, all of the things around gender and race, all of those things should be in the curriculum. But the way you really get there isn't just by replacing them in the tired old conventional classroom models. It's by having those ideas taught in a way that actually honors the true values of the true progressive values, which is that we create a space for dialogue. We create a space in which the values of justice are played out, not just in our ideas about what's happening outside the classroom, but in our interactions in the classroom. So I think that you need not just new curriculum, but new pedagogy as well.
Right. Yeah, we're talking about reimagining the container,
Yes, yes, that's right. Yeah.
that we do education, not just education itself. Like, it's not just the art of education, but it's the practice of education, and how we do that, the spaces that we do that in. What are some other examples in your lived experience of this material? I know that this book is kind of a manifestation of many years of this practice and this visioning, and oops and ouches, is a phrase I like to use. And so, like, give us a little bit more of your own personal journey with manifesting this book.
Yeah, I mean, for me, one of the things that makes it kind of like really personally meaningful is that the book is kind of the culmination of the work that I really started in Oakland, California, when I was working with our friend Matt Fox, and then became the Chicago Wisdom Project in Chicago. And it's I think good ideas, good philosophy, and this is a philosophy of education that I'm putting forth with practice. But good philosophy happens when there's also poetry and practice involved as well. And I think that a lot of the ideas, a lot of the practices arose through just things that happened like on the ground with my students and my fellow teachers that I was working with, and just like how we kind of entered into a process of shared discovery and figured out what worked. So I started the Chicago Wisdom Project in 2009. We're now Wisdom Projects Incorporated because we have the Baltimore Wisdom Project is our kind of sister organization, and we're now a single entity. Most of our youth programming actually happens in Baltimore, and we it's for me it's been a journey of kind of discovering with students and other teachers what actually means to be educated, what's really important, and also too, it happened when the pandemic happened and I began to homeschool my two of my three children, my two younger children, and and it was a process of kind of I of exploring what really mattered to us as a family, and at times it was challenging, but also really rich too. So it was an opportunity to kind of engage in this process holistically, not just to do, because we've done a lot of after school programs and that kind of stuff. The most meaningful stuff we'd ever done in the Chicago Wisdom Project was when we did overnight retreats with larger groups of teens. But here it was, now I was with my kids every day, all day. So that was a process of kind of, you know, discovering what worked with them too.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting how we learn from creation, whether by choice or by kind of forced situation. I did a master's degree during the pandemic. I started and completed a master's degree in the pandemic.
I didn't even know that. Congratulations.
Yeah, thanks. It's right there. I haven't put it up on the wall yet because I don't have any more frames. And I also too, I have that music stand, and I was like, I don't know what to do with this music stand. And then I have those ribbons from Pentecost, and I thought, oh, I can just put that there. And then see, that's an example of playfulness. It's like I had a problem, and I was like, what do I do with all these things? Like, let's just put them together. But that's I think it's funny how when things like that happen, when crisis happen, you know, I often say crisis is the mother of creativity, because it forces us to confront what is happening right in front of us and learn to play with it a little bit and to remold it and reshape it. One of the things I think is really funny about, I'm an artist, a musician and a writer, and a vocalist, and so my whole life has always been rooted in this understanding that self-expression is a very sacred and revolutionary thing. And it even becomes more powerful when you do it with other people in a collective reality, whether that's on the stage or in a flash mob or, you know, in a choir or whatever it might be. Or even just being in a shared space where you're all kind of collectively working on something, even if it's not the same thing. And one of the things that I think is so interesting about that is, to me, life is art. You know, when I get up in the morning and I pick out my outfit, that's art. When I do my hair, when I take a shower, when I brush my teeth, when I design my schedule for the day, all of that is art. All of that is creating the life that I want to live, or the life, or mimicking the life that we are found in. And sometimes art is provocative. It makes us begin to question things as they are. A great example of somebody who does that just so naturally would be Lady Gaga, in that she challenged us to think about what is appropriate to wear in public. What's appropriate to talk about in our songs and things like that. But not just her, people they like David Bowie, Elton John, Liberace, Michael Jackson, Prince. All of these wonderful people are artists, like sculptors, like that guy, whose name I can't remember, Jeff Koons. Jeff Koons is a great modern artist, contemporary artist, who really pushes the envelope on how sculptures look like, you know. All of this is the reality that self-expression and communal expression are ways for us to say that there's always something more. There is actually no scarcity in creation. There's always abundance. And the only reason why we have bought into this false narrative of scarcity is because capitalism always wants us to be edgy, always wants us to be like, oh, I need to go find my completeness here, like I said earlier, you know. So abundance says, no, everything's already here. If you don't see it, you just need to move some things around, which is, again, ultimately what we're kind of talking about with these new methods and philosophy and building a different container. And I think that crisis is oftentimes the thing that really pushes us to live into that more truly.
Yeah, it's that trickster energy where we play with that edge, right? And think of what's possible on the other side. And I talk about that a little bit in the Apocalypse book too, you know, like what's on the other side of this worldview in which we feel bound because this is the way people have been doing things. It's very much part of our pedagogical process in the book. And this new book is this notion that our young people are also can teach us by reimagining. They're given a story that they've got to work through, right? But they're also capable of reimagining that story, and that's where their work as artists come in, is telling their own story in their own way and reimagining the stories they've been given about the world. That's how we evolve. That's how we move beyond the veil to seeing what's possible on the other side.
Well, and that's the reason why I started this series at the beginning of the pandemic, was this idea of, how can we be artisans of this horizon?
Mm-hmm.
How can we play with the life that's unfolding right before our eyes and under our nose? And, what are the values that are undergirding all of that? I think playfulness, curiosity, investigation, taking risk,
Mm-hmm.
that's an important part of education that's oftentimes in our modern classrooms uh, omitted from.
Yeah, we can
Uh,
do it better in a classroom. Should be a space in which we feel cared for, so we can safely take that risk, rather
right.
than in competition where we will be, ostracized if it doesn't work. You know what I mean? Because the world is hard. You take a risk and put yourself out there in the real world. It's hard. A classroom should be a space in which we can take risks a little more safely and explore what might work.
Right, and I oftentimes think that one of our roles as, particularly if we wanted to use the context of children and adults, to use that binary, one of the things that I oftentimes say that it's our job as adults is to teach kids that they can have but this applies to everybody, um, teach kids that they can have a place in their life where they're so loved, they're so affirmed, they're so seen for who they are, this ever unfolding reality, that they can go into the world and take risks throughout their life. And there will always be a place, whether physically or metaphorically, where they can come
Yeah.
to for us to kind of dust them off, bandage them, say some affirmations, build them up so that they can go right back. Because you can't stay in the safe place. You have to go out and venture into the journey, down the road. But even on every journey, that there are places where you stop for rest and refreshments and revitalization, and that's
Right.
an important archetype and role for us to hold as we are becoming these artisans of the horizon. Reimagining the way we educate and lead and love and live.
Absolutely.
So as we close out, I want to give you the mic to say any closing thoughts. Maybe tell folks where can they get your book. There will be a link to the book in the description below. But also, are there any projects that you're doing? Is there another book on the way? All the things.
Yeah, you can find more of our kind of, one of the things we do as an organization, this is Wisdom Projects, is that we put out a podcast and regular articles, poetry. You can find that, my work and other people's work, on reimaginingmagazine.com. You can buy my book wherever you buy a book, Amazon, Barnes and Noble, that kind of stuff, if you just look for me. And I'm working on another book in the future. Yeah, pretty well into a totally different project, a very different project, more personal, more creative project, I think, in a lot of ways. But when we're continuing to do the work on the ground with Wisdom Projects, and and if you can find us at Wisdom Projects, that's with an S.org, and we love to hear from people and get in whatever support we can get is great. So yeah.
Well, I certainly, we've been friends for what, like 4 years now.
Something like that. Yeah, the
Yeah,
pandemic shifts time for me, so it's hard for me to,
yeah, I know. I
yeah,
can't keep
like,
up. Uh,
yeah.
yeah, time is such an illusion now. I mean, the pandemic has really taught us that.
Mhm.
uh, it is also so very fragile as well. But yeah, and I've enjoyed, being friends with you, partly because I gravitate towards people who are thinkers, who are intellectuals, who are artists, who are people who are living their values out in the world. And I think that Wisdom Projects and your two sister organizations really do that very well. And So if anybody is looking for an end of year organization to donate to for a write-off and things like that, please consider Wisdom Projects for that. And before we go, what's your hope for the next year, for 2023?
Every year is so full of surprises. Quite honestly, a lot of my focus and energy in life is with my three children. So I hope they continue to be happy and healthy. Um, my wife Ariane is doing amazing work in the emerging cannabis field, so I'm hoping that she continues to grow in her work. I'm hoping that the kind of energy behind this book, I'm less concerned with how many books I sell, though I'm always happy to sell a book, but I'm really kind of like, this is the kind of work that I'm interested in, kind of growing the movement and energy around different ways of thinking about what it means to be educated in this the notion that thinking about education as completing and competing, training individuals to compete in the global economy is something that I would love to see us let go of, because this global economy is taking us on a path of destruction. I think we need to think creatively about entirely new ways of looking at what it means to be a human, certainly as an educated human.
Well,
that's a lot for just 1 year, but we'll see what we can get. We can see what we can do.
Right. Well, we're already begun. It's already begun. It's already happening. It's and we're just living into it now. And as in all things, remember, dear friends, that life is short, and we do not have much time to gladden the hearts of those who journey with us. So be swift to love, make haste to be kind, and dare to reimagine the world that's unfolding right before you. And the blessing of the God who is the God of peace, the nonviolent Christ, and the liberating Spirit be with you this day and always. Amen.